Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special. I'm Chris Bishop. Well, Youth Day is upon us once again, the day that South Africa pauses to remember the thousands of school children who carried out the so-called Soweto uprising on June the 16th, 1976. Many of them paid with their lives, many more paid with their young bodies and liberty for what they believed in. So one of the survivors joins me on the line now, a man who left Morris Isaacson High School and qualified as a general practitioner, a doctor. His name is Dr. Richard Lebethe. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Lebethe. Every June 16, the years have passed now. What are your feelings on this day always?
It's a recurring feeling. It's a cold morning with children going to school as normal. Some of them knowing that that day is going to be a demonstration day. Most of them not knowing. It's a day in which children hoped to go and demonstrate and go back to school in the afternoon, which was never to be. And the activity in Orlando West, they keep reflecting. You can't stop thinking back to them. But at the same time, they spare you that now that we've gone this far, can we ever go back? And that's why you'll hear, and every time the guys talk, they say as jiki, even up to now. And that means forward we go. And that's the feeling that I keep getting every day. I'm sure that we haven't exactly reached where we were going, but I'm still hopeful that that place will be reached.
Just reflecting as well on that protest which you took part in. When you see in this modern world the Black Lives Matter protests around the world, what is your feeling? And also the fact that you guys were just children, you were unarmed, and you went into arguably a more violent and prepared force than anybody is facing around the world with this Black Lives Matter protests.
Yeah, it's a situation we found ourselves in. It will reflect to you that at the beginning of it all, there was never any intention of violence from the children. And as I keep thinking about it, I say to myself, you know, the brutality of a system has inherent in it the solution to the problem it created. Now we have here the children who walked peacefully, who had no ilk of violence within them. And they turned out to be violent because they were met. Their peace was met with violence. And those are the days of our lives. Now, today, if you mention the question of Black Lives Matter, I mean, at that stage, we were not as philosophical as all that. We had a particular problem, which was a school problem, which we needed to deal with. We had a message to deliver. But the system, the brutality thereof, taught us that in me as a bad system, I have solutions for the problems that I have created. And then they meted violence against us. And that's when everything else changed to what ultimately became known as June 16, which was the start of all the activities. Of course, the activities were started later, but with that tone, it changed the tone of the freedom activities.
So just take us back to that winter's morning of June 16, 1976. You were heading for a day of protest and also a day of school at Morris Isaacson High School in Soweto. Just in your own words, just tell us exactly how it all unfolded.
Like I say, it was going to become a normal morning. And a normal morning it was. We went to the assembly, went through the usual routine, assembly routine. And as the teacher left the assembly point, then the student leader in the name of C.C. Mashinini took up the stage and spoke to us for a moment, and a song came up because there were those amongst us who knew what was happening. He declared that this had to do with Bantu education, because at that time, there was enforcement of language, the Afrikaans language, as a medium of instructions to the schools. But the irony of it all is that all the high schools in Soweto, including Morris Isaacson's, Afrikaans wasn't being enforced upon them. That was only in the junior secondary schools. So what should be understood is that even though the high schools did take a lead, they were not particularly affected. And that shows the togetherness in the people and the troubles that follow them. And then post those songs, we were singing and we walked out of the campus, walked around and started collecting students in other schools, particularly targeted were junior secondaries and higher, and junior secondaries and high schools. And those in the primaries were given instructions to go home so that they don't get caught out in the troubles that may come up. Now, the rendezvous was going to be Orlando Stadium. Now, if you check Morris Isaacson, it's about 15 km away from Orlando Stadium. And what it actually meant is that the walk was going to collect all the school in between in a walk towards Orlando Stadium, where we were going to meet the students from Orlando, students from Deep Blue, and the Naledi High students were going to come along in another route where we were going to have a demonstration, a full peaceful demonstration at Orlando Stadium. And indeed, the walk did happen. We kept collecting students, sending the younger ones home. From time to time, we'd stop along the way, whereby we'd have a speech or two, very short speech of two, a motivational speech from the leaders, in particular, C.C. Mashinini. And then we walked on until we reached Matseke High. That's Orlando West High. At that stage, when we reached there were policemen who came from the side of where there is the current Hector Peterson Memorial. And unfortunately, that's where the dogs were released onto the students, and the first gunshot went at that particular place. That's where Hector Peterson died. And then there was mayhem all along. There's a little mountain behind Orlando West High. That's just above, around where Winnie Mandela's house later got built. There was tear gas all over, dogs. A dog that was released was caught by one of the students who took out a knife and stabbed it to death. But it literally looked like a war zone, whereby overcame with tear gas, some students will go towards the mountain while others were engaged in the police. And then when they have recovered, they would come back, some would go and rest. It's very unfortunate that it actually appeared like a war zone. And it's there that a number of them, a number of the students got killed, got shot. And in no time, there were helicopters all around, and students started dispersing. It was not a normal dispersion. It was a warlike dispersion, because from that point, it meant students were going to walk all over Soweto as they go back home. And it's during that moving back home that most of the destruction happened. And particularly those things that were destroyed were anything that belonged to the government. The offices, which represented what the government stood for.
How old were you
So,
on that day? Sorry, Dr.
I was
Lebethe.
17.
And what
17, yeah.
What were you feeling? I mean, you must have seen nothing like this before. And the people around you, what was the idea of the feeling amongst all of you on that day?
Well, it's a situation that was not anticipated. We were expecting to be children who protest when things are not done right according to themselves. But the gunshots were a shocker, an absolute shocker. And it instantly brought us to an emotional freezing moment, whereby when the adrenaline shoots up, you start feeling in a way that you have never felt before, which happens to be one of my poems that I wrote around that time, when I felt a feeling I was not supposed to have felt.
So you didn't expect it, none of you. What do you remember of the security forces who were there? You must have seen their faces. You must have had some idea of what they were going to do. Just give us an idea of what your feelings were at that moment.
Well, we couldn't have had an idea of what they were going to do. But the one thing that was clear, it's the usual faces that we got to know of the security forces. Cold, uncaring, forceful, not even realizing or recognizing the fact that they were dealing with children whose issue had to do with school and nothing beyond school. And that's what happened. They never cared. They were just hard-faced, very cold on a cold morning. And of course, that coldness we were used to. The only thing that went beyond what they usually did was the gunshot and the first meeting of tear gas ever. I think it was the first time that tear gas was ever used in Soweto. And that brought about absolute confusion, the rush of adrenaline, and you can imagine what would happen thereafter.
What did happen thereafter?
Well, the anger that flushed into the students. I mean, as they walked back, I think there's a place in a white city where there used to be a white guy by the name of Dr. Elder Stein, who had spent quite a lot of time amongst the people there. But because at that stage, he represented the system, what happened is that that guy ended up being killed by those children, by the peoples. Now, you can imagine if you move from an intent of a peaceful march and you end up with people dead. Of course, it didn't just come out of the blue, because what they had just seen was nothing they had met before. They had seen the flowing of blood. They had seen their friends being shot dead with blood gushing out of their mouth, out of the wounds and all that. And obviously to them, that was a declaration of war, which is what happened exactly on that day.
Do you have any regrets at all these years later, the fact that there was violence that was meted out in retaliation to what you were facing?
I don't have any regrets. It was basically a necessary move. Remember, I said to you earlier on, the brutality of a system has inherent in it the solution of the problems it created. And it's the only way. That was an absolutely necessary moment for the turning around of the emotions and the ambitions of the people. Because I said to you earlier on, the intention was just to demonstrate in relation to school issues and go back to school. But the brutality of the system said to us, you can't even get the most minimum of things as good as education. So it became necessary for us, we learned from that the only way that we can survive is to demand even more. Because prior to that march, there was no talk of violence, there was no talk of overturning the state, it was only a talk of stopping the enforcement of Afrikaans in the junior secondaries. That march, yes, sir?
As the day wore on, how did things get even worse for yourself and your schoolmates in where you were on that day?
Now, if you talk about my schoolmates, you'll remember that I was from Maurice Isaacson's High. Maurice is almost in the center of Soweto in Jabavu. But I come from Diepkloof, which is the eastern part of Soweto. And Maurice Isaacson had students almost from all over Soweto, wide as it is, inclusive of those students who came from Alexander. Some came from Randfontein. I suppose there were even some from the East Rand. So when that thing happened, as we start moving from home, from that place of war, going back home, there was just carnage along the way. Now, for me, if I'm to go home, I had to go across the rail line and walk towards Diepkloof. And you somewhere you were jumping corpses. I mean, there was just blood all over. A dead dog here, which was being burned. And that's what happened on that day. But for me, in Diepkloof, because the activities did not start on the 16th. They started on the 17th, which kept the momentum of what had started on the 16th. So as I got towards home, it was a little bit quieter. I mean, people were just organizing themselves for the following day. And it never stopped from then. It just kept continuing.
So the next day, what was the strategy? What was the atmosphere again on the day after? And what did you do?
Now, the next day, remember then there was no transport, there was nothing. And when I go to Maurice Isaacson, I had to take a bus and a taxi, which were not available on that day. But prior to my going to Maurice, I was a student in Madivane High, which is in Diepkloof, which is where all the guys that I grew up with were. And that's the day the activity started in Diepkloof. So basically, I became part of the activities in Diepkloof as it started spreading all over. And each day it was spreading to a new place and spreading all over Soweto, Alexander, a few days later in Alexander. And in no time, it was all over the country.
What about the crackdown after that? Because I know that the police came down heavily looking for people. People were on the run. People went into exile. Just give us an idea of what you recall from that.
Although the crackdown was almost instant, but people didn't start skipping the country immediately after the June 16th demonstration. They were searching particularly for leaders, the CAT machinists and the likes. But it went a little bit quiet to the point that around that time, it was organized, the winter school. It's around the time when the winter schools were organized. and it went calm. And then post-June holidays, we went back to school. Now, the more bad march was the march on August the 4th, whereby the students were demanding the release of the other students who were arrested and kept in jail. And it's the massacre on that march whereby I remember one of my mentors, A.B. Libilo, who was the chief prefect in Madibani High and a member of the SSRC, was shot dead. It brought quite a lot of mayhem. And it's after the 4th of August that people started skipping the country en masse. But you'll remember people had already started skipping even before June the 16th. One here, 3 there, 1 there. But the majority of them skipped after August the 4th, where it was very certain that what happened on June 16 was not a mistake, and that the state had intended in doing what they had done, and they were going to do more of it.
And what about your schoolmates as well? Some of them went on to become ministers in the democratic government. Some of them went on to become quite famous people. Who was also with you on that day? Who put the rest of their lives into doing something?
Yeah. The truth is, amongst that generation, none of them became a minister. Not much of them got into government, other than Dan Mutsitsi became the member of parliament at some stage. But more prominent were people like Mafi Marobe, who's one of the cornerstones of the activities of June 16, right from the start and up to the end. He ended up being arrested with some of his colleagues. But those are the guys who were in the forefront, because most of those who were part of the SSRC, especially those who became leaders, ended up skipping the country. Remember, Stietsi skipped the country immediately after the march of August the 4th. He was replaced by Khotso Seatlolo, who later on had to skip the country, then replaced by Profomo Sono. And it kept going on that way. And you couldn't become a leader for a long period of time because the system was after the leaders. But the one who really eluded them was Mafi Marobe, who remained in the country and ended up in Robben Island. But he's the one who lifted the span of each activity that happens in June 16, or from June 16 onwards.
And just one final question for you. In latter years, we've had commissions in South Africa looking into corruption, the misuse of public money. You read the papers about them the same as the rest of us. When you see things like that, do you have any tinge of regret after what you and your schoolmates went through in the cause of freedom?
You know, it's not particularly regrets, because if you look at it, the development of anything has stages. You will remember even in post-colonialism, the ANC came into being with the intention of addressing the problems that we had. Later on came in the PAC, we started working with the ANC towards that, and later the Black Consciousness Movement. And then post-freedom, as those commissions started, it's, I think it's a period that has activities that needs to be looked into. It's the transitions which inherent in them are the challenges. But at the same time, like I said earlier on, even these challenges inherent in them, depending on how brutal they are to our people, they still bear the solutions to the problems that they have created. So the students around June 16 who had a slogan that the tree of liberation is watered by the blood of the martyrs, which means from the start, what they were doing was not particularly for themselves. They were just contributing to what the bigger outcome, which everyone else who follows, the subsequent generations, have a responsibility of getting the things right from where they were started.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Dr. Richard Lebethe, who was a survivor of the 1976 Soweto uprising, which is commemorated every year in South Africa on June the 16th. I'm afraid that's all we have time for on this CNBC Africa special. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.